Joining us now is MSNBC's legal correspondent Lisa Rubin, who watched that trial unfold from inside the Manhattan courthouse. Also with us, former assistant Manhattan district attorney and MSNBC legal analyst Catherine Christian, and Brendan Buck, the former aide to then speakers John Boehner and Paul Ryan. He's also an MSNBC political analyst. So, Lisa, what happens between now and September 18th? Is there a possibility the whole case could eventually be thrown out?
Andrea, there's a possibility that the verdict can be set aside, but is it likely? No. Between now and September 18th, each party will submit briefs. And really what the issue is whether or not Judge Juan Merchan improperly admitted evidence of actions that Donald Trump took while he was president that would qualify as official acts under the Supreme Court's decision earlier this week. In that ruling, the Supreme Court saying not only is the former president immune for official acts that he took from prosecution, immune from prosecution, but he is also immune in the sense that evidence of his official conduct can't be used in other cases against him, ones that go at solely his private conduct. So each side will submit briefs about the evidence that was submitted at trial, and Donald Trump's lawyers will have to prove not only was that evidence improperly admitted, but it would have changed the jury's verdict because they wouldn't have had enough evidence to sustain all of the charges and each element thereof. I think they're likely to fail on that, but between now and September 6th, when the judge is going to rule on those motions, we will find out how that all goes down.
And Catherine, we're talking about evidence, in particular the Hope Hicks testimony, Michael Cohen in the Oval Office, that key meeting. So was there enough documentary evidence, other kinds of confirming evidence, do you think, that the case stands, or does it have to be retried?
To quote Prosecutor Josh Stanglass, there was a mountain of evidence of guilt. So if you take out Hope Hicks' testimony, you take out the tweets, there's a mountain of evidence that points to guilt. And under New York law, prejudicial evidence that is admitted doesn't necessarily cause a conviction reverse, only if it's so prejudicial it denies the defendant a fair trial. That's what the New York State Court of Appeals, that's why they reversed Harvey Weinstein. So I agree with Lisa that Judge Merchan should have said what he said about, he can't say, of course, the sentencing will occur, because that means he's already made up his mind. So he has not made up his mind. He's going to read the briefs, and then we will find out. But I think the defense, who should have filed this motion, they would have been incompetent not to, but I think the motion will fail.
Brendan, let's talk about the calendar and the political impact. Would it have been better for Donald Trump to have the sentencing next week as originally scheduled, or in September, that close to the campaign, well, to the election, when the campaign is absolutely, red hot?
Yeah, I don't think I would want to do anything right now that's going to change the subject from what's been going on with the president's debate performance. But you're absolutely right. Moving it closer to the election is not actually an ideal scenario. We know that in June, fewer people are going to be paying attention. And if he is sentenced, particularly to any even short amount of jail time, that would be an enormous story right before the election, and remind people of what polling shows is their biggest concern about him, which is his conduct. Now, all of that is clearly very overshadowed right now, and who knows what the world looks like or this race looks like in September. But right now, I don't think they would like anything to get in the way of the story that we've been talking about for days and days now.
And Catherine, that's Stormy Daniels. So she weighed in with Rachel last night, and she said that she hopes that Judge Merchan gives Donald Trump jail time. Let's watch that.
Fighting him is not going to do any good.
Yeah.
I think, taking away his control which is freedom, by a jail sentence, if that's what fits it, would teach him the most, because he's so used to being in control.
Yeah.
It's not about locking him out and taking away his freedom, it's not taking away his control. Would be more helpful in this case, I think.
So what options are really on the table for the judge? That seems extremely unlikely, especially given everything that's happened with the High Court and the fact that Judge Merchan does not want to, fuel an appeal more so than the appeal is obviously going to take place. But would this mean a lighter sentence? Yeah.
Yeah, I watched that interview last night. She has every right to believe that because her life has basically been destroyed by what happened. So she should believe that. I think it's highly unlikely that Judge Merchan in September is going to put the leading candidate for one party for president in jail. But his options are a jail sentence, and a jail sentence is really defined as a misdemeanor, not a misdemeanor, 1 year or less. So that in New York, that would be Rikers Island. A prison sentence would be a year or more. So he can give a maximum of 4. People who keep talking about 20 years and 100. This is not a consecutive case under the law, under New York law. He can give probation. He can give additional discharge. He can give a fine. So he has a number of options he can do. I do not think one of them will be incarceration.
And Lisa, you also were inside the courtroom watching Stormy Daniels and very powerful testimony. And so she says that taking the stand, and she did that reluctantly under subpoena. She cooperated with the prosecution, but she says it has really added gasoline to the fire of the harassment, the threats that she was already facing. Let's watch that.
My mailbox was destroyed. My animals have been injured. My daughter can't go outside. There's press and looky-loos out there. I'm afraid to go outside. The death threats are so much more graphic and detailed and brazen. Like, people don't care. Most importantly, like, Trump is trying to make an example out of me, of anybody who dare stand up to him.
So the judge did alter the gag order last week, so it's still, it doesn't protect witnesses any longer, right? Like Stormy Daniels.
It does not protect witnesses like Stormy Daniels. And Andrea, as sympathetic as a figure as Stormy Daniels is, and I believe what she's saying about the harassment, you also have to remember that she and Michael Cohen, the lead witness in this trial, have been highly critical of former President Trump on their social media platforms and in other places. And essentially what Judge Merchan decided was that it wasn't fair to allow Stormy Daniels and Michael Cohen to come on this network and other places, including their social media platforms, and talk ad nauseum about former President Trump and their criticisms of him, but not allow him to do the same. Now, granted, they don't have the same sized megaphone, and granted, the impact is very different. I don't think former President Trump, for example, is facing the same sort of threats as Stormy Daniels and Michael Cohen on account of the things they are saying about him. On the other hand, if one party gets to speak, Judge Merchan decided the other one does too, and since the trial is behind us, the danger of it impacting the fairness and integrity of the proceeding is no longer something he's worried about.
Hey there, MSNBC fans. I'm Luke Russert, and be sure to join me, Rachel Maddow, Jen Psaki, Lawrence O'Donnell, Steve Kornacki, Joy Reid, and many more September 7th in Brooklyn, MSNBC Live Democracy 2024. Click on the link for ticket information. We will see you there.